Hey everyone, Steve here again with another random video. In this video, I'm taking the internals from this worn Gameboy Advance SP into a new shell and adding a glowing LED mod to the base of the unit as well. I purchased this untested Game Boy a little over a year ago, and from what I remember, it had a power issue with it not charging off wall power with neither its original nor replacement battery. I intended to replace the connector in this video as well, but when I took another look at this unit before filming, it was working again. So it's possible I misremembered the issue from over a year ago, or I could have disconnected and reconnected the power enough to dislodge something in the connector to get it working again. I was hoping to do a repair, but since I had the other supplies, I decided to keep working with the shell mod for this video. For the replacement shell, I purchased a clear, transparent shell from Handheld Legends along with matching buttons. I went with this one as it fits the original screen, and if I wanted to upgrade it to an LED screen, it would involve little to no cutting into the shell. I also had to purchase replacement hinges as the originals would be too loose in this third-party shell. From the same website, I also purchased the RGB LED Flex Board that SARs onto the main board from 5 points. So we have our replacement parts and a console. Now it's time for disassembly. To disassemble, I start by flipping over the unit, removing the battery cover, and the battery itself. To remove the bottom portion of the shell, 6 screws must be removed using a tri-point Y0 bit. With the bottom shell removed, the main board is next. There are 3 screws holding down the board and can be removed with a Phillips PH1 bit. When the screws are removed, the board can't be removed just yet as the display cable is still connected. Flipping it over carefully and using tweezers, it can be disconnected. Now that the board is free, we can add the flex board. I started by lining up the soldering points between the flex board and the main board. When lined up, I used a couple strips of Captain tape to secure it to the board. There are 6 points to solder on the flex board, but one of the points is related to having an LED screen installed on the SP. Since I wasn't planning to install one at this time, I ignored this point. The first 2 soldering points that were near the applied tape were quick and simple. For the third point that was ground, you'll see I had a hard time getting this to bond with the soldering point on the main board. I put force on the flex board to flow solder to the bottom board, but it wouldn't bond. I would eventually move to the bottom 2 points while I thought of a solution. I had a little trouble again getting solder to stick to the main board on the bottom, but realized I would need to tape the bottom portion of the flex board to keep those 2 soldering points in place. Since my flexboard was bonded by 4 points, I carefully removed my tape. Going back to the soldering point that was giving me trouble, I decided to slightly bend the flexboard and place solder on the main board, unbend the flexboard, and melt both solder blobs together to form a bond. That seemed to make it finally stick. To test that the LEDs work, I placed the battery against the battery prongs on the back of the board and flipped the power switch. With the LED mod working, I disassembled the rest of the old shell to get to the screen. To note, I kept the original speaker with fabric cover, the rubber button pads, volume switch, and the original screws. For screen removal, I removed the 5 rubber pads covering the screw holes on the screen and removed the screws with the tri-point Y0 screw bit. The screen itself isn't held down by any adhesive, but before pulling it out, you must carefully remove the screen cable first. Flipping over the shell again by the controls, there's a hidden Phillips screw that keeps a plate in place that covers the coiled screen cable. I removed this using a Phillips PH1 bit. When this screw is removed, the plate can easily be removed along with the screen cable. Then, with the screen out, I got to work assembling the new shell. I started by placing the screen in first, along with the cable. I inserted new hinges but secured them later. Once the hinges were in, I could start reassembly of the screen and the base of the console. For the bottom portion of the new shell, I had to assemble the left and right shoulder buttons. This requires attaching a spring and metal post to the button itself and then bending the other end of the spring into a plastic slot in the shell. Closing the shell can be a little troubling because of those posts from the shoulder buttons, but it eventually closed. When I got to placing the battery, I had to reopen the shell due to finding out you need to add a square nut to the bottom for the battery cover to screw into. For the hinges, there's a plastic cover that slides onto the outside portion of the hinge. Depending how far you insert the new hinges during installation, these could be a little hard to slip on. I also had to make sure the covers were flush with the new shell. I couldn't think of a better way to do this, so I put the console on each side and applied some force on it to get the hinge and cover all the way into the slot. If there was a better way to do this, let me know in the comments. But the hinges felt more secure to the screen afterward. As a final touch, I removed the old Nintendo sticker from the previous console shell. I used a plastic razor blade to initially get under the adhesive before pulling it off. It was still sticky enough to apply to the new shell without the need for additional adhesive. Although, the corner I used the blade on kept curling, so I removed a small bit of it since I wouldn't be able to adhere to such a small piece. So, after all that, I tested the console again, and it still works. Now, this would have been close to the original ending of the video, but while editing this and playing with the mod Game Boy off camera, I found the original screen to be lacking even with the built-in backlight. So, I went back to Handheld Legend and purchased an IPS screen to replace the current one. Also, while browsing the site, I saw an additional mod for a replacement USB-C connector in place for the proprietary power port. I decided to add this to the console as well since I wasn't planning to sell this to anyone. So, with my new parts, I opened the console again. I started with the screen since it wouldn't require much work. After adding a foam pad to the back of the screen shell, I had to add a translucent sticker to the back of the new display that supposedly helps with heat dispersion on the screen. Next, I connected the cable coming out of the screen to this conjoined flex board and ribbon cable. Be careful not to damage either the female or male connectors as they are very fragile. For the display cable, I pre-rolled it to make sure that it would fit in the hinge of the shell, and carefully slid the cable into the slot on the shell. Eventually, I found it easier to close the top portion of the shell with the screen side down first. Back at the main board, I figured I would tackle the USB-C port next. I started by desoldering the old port first. I did this in two parts by removing the solder on the 6 pins with solder wick first. Then, I placed the board in my helping hand and used my hot air station to remove the mounting points for the connector. To ensure no other components moved around, I placed Kapton tape on some components around the board. I did have a little trouble getting solder to melt, so I added some of my own solder to help reflow the solder joints. That seemed to help with getting the old port removed. When the old port was removed, I used my solder wick to remove the rest of the old solder. Now that the old port and solder were removed, I began the new port installation process. I added fresh solder to the existing mounting points. Next, I lined up the mounting points on the main board and with the USB-C port as best as I could. To keep the port in place, I tried using Kapton tape, but it wasn't the best method. Ultimately, I had to hold the port down with one finger, place extra solder on my iron, and fill the mounting point on one end until I believed both the solder blobs between the main board and USB-C port bonded. Once I had a secure bond, I could do a better job on the second point and redo the first point afterward. On this solder board, there's only one pin to solder. The downside though is that it's tough to solder using my normal soldering iron since my smallest tip is too big for the pin. I had to switch to a different soldering iron with a knife tip, along with my microscope to accurately bond this pin to the board. I couldn't film my microscope, so I apologize for the lack of footage. When I finished soldering, I wanted to test that the port works since it would be hard to take the system apart when the new screen is connected later. So far, we have the screen installed in the shell and the USB port working. Now for the final part of connecting the screen to the main board. For this part, we'll need to solder three things. The last soldering point on the LED Flex Board from earlier that controls the screen brightness, one end of the jumper wire that goes onto this soldering point, and the other end of the jumper wire onto the ribbon cable for the screen. The easiest point to take care of first is the last via on the LED Flex Board. Next, I added a solder blob to the flex cable. If you chose to perform this mod yourself, you may choose to do the order differently, but I chose to add the jumper wire onto the flex cable before bonding to the flex board. Connecting the screen while also being able to solder one end of the wire was a little tricky to prop everything up without falling over, but I managed to get this done. When the wire was bonded, I wanted to test that everything worked before closing the system for good. This console will be more fragile to disassembly if there's any trouble in the future. One of the last steps before closing the console was adding the plastic that would fill the hole that used to be occupied by the old power connector. The connector came with a 3D printed model that I chose to superglue into the case. In retrospect, I don't think it really needed it, as the glue didn't make the plastic part more secure and seemed to stay in place when the shell was closed. As I was getting ready to close the case, I noticed that I wasn't closing where the new USB-C connector is located. After disassembling the bottom shell, I found that when I add this USB-C mod, the daughter board that the port is connected to is in the way of one of the screw stocks on the plastic shell. This was causing the shell not to close all the way. As a quick remedy, I grabbed a file and grinded the stock to be almost flat with the rest of the surrounding plastic. While filing, I also scratched the battery compartment a bit, but when the battery is inserted, it won't be noticed. When I test fit the bottom shell again, it fit flush. So, back to closing the console for, hopefully, the final time. And now, my console mod is officially complete. After using the SP for a while, I have to say it's a lot better than how it used to be, especially the new screen compared to the stock. I never realized I was missing out on an improved image compared to my original GBA I'm used to playing on. The new case is great as well, along with the backlit buttons. Personally, I prefer one solid color or stack individual lights instead of the strobing effect, but it's great to have different lighting options to express yourself. The USB-C mod is a good addition, so I don't have to carry a unique charger if I plan to travel with it or happen to lose its specific adapter. I'll note that the downside of this USB-C mod is that you can no longer use headphones or use an adapter, since this Game Boy console never had a headphone jack built in to begin with. There may be a better USB mod in the future that utilizes the abandoned traces instead of this one, but for me, I'm fine with using the built-in speaker. Since this video is getting long, I'm uploading a separate video on how to adjust the screen brightness and color settings for the backlit buttons. In closing, I felt this was a good project to work on and would recommend it to others that either want to improve or repair their console on the condition that they have some soldering experience, especially towards the USB-C mod. Now, it's time for me to catch up on some games. This is Steve signing off, and stay safe everyone.